Bentley here. Good evening to you. On behalf of the Calgary Climate Hub, I welcome you to A Climate of Change, our live cast exploring with thought leaders from across Canada what these wildly unprecedented times mean for addressing the climate crisis here in Alberta and how to create the impactful change we need. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Yaqsi Nakota Nations, the Métis Nations of Region 3, and all people who make their home in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. I'd like to also make a second land acknowledgement on behalf of another group of folks that have a stake in this land that we stand on today, and that is our children, our nieces and nephews and grandchildren, and all future generations. I urge you to keep them in mind during this time as we face unprecedented change and start making decisions about what comes next. It can never be said enough that every election is a climate election. Over the next year here in Alberta, we have at least one and possibly two critically important elections headed our way. That's why we're very happy to have on tonight's guest, Dave Meslin, author of Tear Down, Rebuilding Democracy from the Ground Up. What I'm holding my hand is the remedy for just about everything that's currently everybody hates about politics and governance. I can tell you in the reading of this book, about half the time there's some emotional turbulence that goes on because he expresses exactly what it is that is so frustrating. But then the second half of the chapter is all about solutions that are actually working in other places in the world, which tells you that it's possible to change this stuff, and we aren't stuck with any of it. We can fix it. Tear Down is one of those rare books that you can actually feel yourself getting smarter as you read it. I recommend everybody gets a hold of it. Dave Meslin, welcome to A Climate of Change.
So great to be here. Thanks for the invitation, and thank you to everyone who's watching out there.
You bet. So, you know, the big questions that I have tonight, I mean, there's a lot of them about the elections, but I want to sort of pan back and ask some really big questions, some big picture stuff. And so, you know, one of the things that we try to do and try to encourage in the climate activism realm is to see everything through a climate lens. And, you know, so we've seen a lot of tectonic global events over the last year to year and a half, from COVID to the insurrection in America on January 6th to like even just today, the grid in Texas going down and the disaster going on there. And so I guess the question that I want to ask you, and really what the show is about, is this a climate of change? Is this a time where do you think people are seeing these enormous things and recognizing, hey, we've got to fix this stuff? Do you feel like maybe this is a time where people are starting to clue in that things like our election system and on all these other things need to get addressed and can get behind the ideas that we're seeing in your book?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're on the cusp of that. The big transition I'm pushing for is to get people, I mean, the push for change has been there for a long time. The problem is what people think that change should look like. Mm-hmm. So for example, the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, they obviously felt an urgent need for change in their minds. You know, most of the really popular politicians on the right and the left for decades have been the ones who are saying we need to shake things up, we need to change. In fact, I start the whole book by pointing out that a lot of the most popular characters on the right and the left are actually saying the same thing. And I offer a few quotes from both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, and quotes from the Tea Party and the Occupy movement, and I challenge the reader to tell me which one is which. So the desire for change isn't something we need to push for or create. It's actually been there for quite some time. The problem is that people keep pinning all their hopes on an individual or a party and think that if we just get the right person in, we'll be fine. So maybe a lot of the progressives in Alberta thought, oh, we just need to get the NDP in there. And, you know, the whole world will change. You've got people who think that we just need to get someone like Bernie Sanders or AOC in there in the States. And of course, you've got people who think we just need to get a Donald Trump in there. And my message is like, guys, everyone just slow down, take a step back, and realize that you're just playing into this reality TV show where you think it's all about personalities and winners and losers, when in fact, it's the system itself that has been screwing us over for decades and will continue to screw us over regardless of who is in power. Not to say we should ignore elections, not at all. Elections are really important. Your upcoming municipal elections will be very important. But if we just focus on who is in power, instead of how we decide who is in power, what they do once they're in power, how power is shared within a council, within a legislature, what mechanisms we use to create these elections in the first place, from the design of the ballot to the design of the campaign finance rules, I think we're in big trouble. So yes, there is a sense of urgency. Yes, I feel like we're heading towards a time of change in a good way. This is the first time that a generation is taking power who grew up in the environmental movement. I mean, that's really exciting. Yeah. But I mean, you and I have witnessed people saying that change is urgent for 40 years. Right. I mean, I remember going to a rally in the late 90s where the theme was no time to waste. My God, right? So yeah, of course there's some urgency, but that's not going to help us because we've seen that go nowhere.
Right. You know, in the climate world, I think about how much easier it is right now to be a climate activist than 10 years ago or 20 years ago, because, you know, there was a lot of stagnancy, and then all of a sudden, not on the part of them, you know, we're facing heavy denialism and distraction, but you know, there's a lot of people who've been in this for a long game, and it was a very tough emotional slog, but we started to get some wins of late, and that's great. Let me ask you, I'm conscious of those moments similar, like January 6th, where everybody all over the world, if you had freedom of movement and you had access to the internet or TV, you know, you got that call where somebody said, hey, you go and turn on the TV, and you say, what channel? And they say, any channel. And if you had freedom of movement and access to YouTube or cable, you just watch this thing play out in front of you. And I'm conscious of those moments where the whole world is paying attention to the same thing. And so that brings me back to COVID and that first lockdown, where all of us took it as serious as we've ever taken it. And there's a lot of us that just looked out the window and thought about, we didn't have anything else to do other than think about things. And I wonder how many people thought about the system and all of these things that we live in. And so I guess my question that I have for you is, do you think there's a big teachable moment that might have cut through to people from this time?
Yeah, it's probably politically incorrect to like look at the bright side of COVID, but there are many. I mean, for me, it's actually been an amazing year in lots of ways. And you know, in a way you might not imagine, but you know, we hear a lot about the mental health impact of COVID in terms of people feeling really isolated or worrying about their finances. But for some of us who are addicted to work, and are overachievers and used to have our schedules taking us to 1 million meetings a day and a lot of travel time, and you'd leave the house in the morning for meetings and you'd come back in the evening because there's always a political rally, forum, summit. I used to be stretched so thin, and I've had a lot of mental health issues over the last decade that required medication, and it was a mess, and I've never felt more grounded than this year because it forced me to slow down. And it's also forced a lot of us to just slow down in the sense of consumption. Like, we're all consuming less. We're realizing that you can have a nice evening without going out and buying something or paying to be entertained. We can. So, I mean, in terms of, you know, one common thread of all the environmental movements over the last 20, 30 years has been, you know, do we need to be, you know, it doesn't mean that you're anti-capitalist to suggest that we're all consuming too much, right? Right. You know, you can say, okay, free markets are great. Let's embrace all the good things that come with having an open market, but like, do we need to be obsessively keeping up with our neighbors and buying and buying? And so many things we buy are disposable. And I think it's been a good year for that. And yeah, maybe it's forced a lot of us to slow down and think about what's really important. But I think the bigger thing in the past 10 years, you know, in the long run, looking back, the internet will be a bigger impact than COVID. I hate to say it, but I think 2 years from now, COVID will just seem like this really weird thing that happened. It'll be a blip. Well, it'll seem like a really weird dream where we all wore masks for 2 years and we're like, what, did that really happen?
Right.
But the internet, I think, is really changing everything, you know, especially for youth. It's allowing them to become more engaged, more informed, and angrier and participatory at a much younger age than you or I were. Like, when I was in high school, no one was walking out of school because of the environment. No one was walking out. We weren't doing anything political. It just wasn't a thing. So whereas political engagement, you know, 100 years ago was just for, you know, older property owners. And then in the 60s, you know, it was for, you know, people in their 20s on campuses. Now it's kids. Like, kids are actually getting involved in politics. That was unheard of 30 years ago. So I'm really excited about that. And I don't think that has anything to do with COVID. It has to do with Snapchat and Instagram. And even though a lot of parents my age are really worried about all the screen time their kids are exposed to, let me be devil's advocate and say that my screen time in the 90s was just playing the most stupid, mindless video games alone. There was nothing interactive. There was no useful content. I was just playing Tetris for hours and hours, staring at a monochrome screen. And the kids these days, yeah, they have too much screen time, but they're actually interacting with their friends. And as much garbage as there is on TikTok and Snapchat and Discord, they are also getting exposed to political memes. And I don't think Me Too, I Don't Know More, or Black Lives Matter would have happened in the disruptive way they did without smartphones and apps.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of the biggest changes we've seen over the last 20 years, or at least 15 or so, has a hashtag in front of it. That was the first I heard of Me Too, was hashtag Me Too. First I heard of Black Lives Matter. First I heard of Occupy. First I heard of anything. It's
totally
a hashtag.
Occupy, absolutely. And flip side, you know, Stop the Steal and Tea Party and Make America Great Again. You know, you have to take it all as a package, but it is allowing people, for better or worse, to plug in. And I mean, I think we're seeing unprecedented levels of engagement. We just saw the highest level, the highest number of votes ever. Both Trump and Biden got the most votes ever. These are great things. I'm working on a campaign right now to lower the voting age in Canada, federally, provincially, and municipally. And I think any way that we can boost political engagement is absolutely necessary right now.
Yeah. Okay. So getting into the election stuff, one of the big solutions, it may be the biggest, although, you know, maybe Citizens Assembly is the biggest. I'm not sure, but you know, one of the prime solutions, I think, is first past the post versus proportional representation. And I mean, I guess for our audience, maybe would you mind giving a brief description of both?
Yeah,
and then we'll talk about how that affects our Calgary election coming up.
And you know what? This is such a frustrating thing to talk about because there are very complex issues out there and complex solutions that need intellectual debate because the solutions aren't black and white. So take guaranteed basic income, right? That's an idea that's been floated. I've heard really good arguments for it and really good arguments against it, and hybrid models, and it's a fascinating topic. First past the post doesn't deserve any debate. No rational, sensible adult or child can argue with a straight face that first past the post is even worthy of being considered a voting system. It's not just a bad voting system. It is not a voting system. And I apologize if anyone thinks that that's a radical statement, but it's not. if a voting system is, if we were to define a voting system as something that is designed to translate people's desires, wishes, and votes into some kind of legislative body, whether that's a council or an assembly or a House of Commons, some kind of legislative body that represents what people wanted and is designed to maximize, people's choice and allow them to vote with their heart and allow them to get what they asked for. First past the post achieves none of those goals, nor does it even try. So there are voting systems that try to achieve majoritarian views, trying to achieve a proportional outcome. First past the post strives for nothing, it achieves nothing. It pushes us towards a two-party system, which Albertans know all about, Americans know all about. Canadians kind of know about it. We have an NDP federally as a third party, we have the Bloc, but we have only had two parties in power in the entire history of Canada, blue and red, back and forth, blue, red, blue, red, blue, red, blue, red, 150 years. This is unbelievable. And Alberta, you guys had the same party in power for pretty much my whole life, I think, except for a little blop. And then when someone tried to start a new party, which I think is cool, whether you like Wild Rose or not, I was like, cool, new parties are cool. Of course, it remerged, just like the Reform remerged with the Conservatives. This is what First Past the Post does. It stifles innovation. So it would be like, only if you're a beer drinker, I'm not, by the way, but if you were, if you only had Labatt and Molson, and like the entire idea of like microbreweries and, small batch craft brewing, just was unheard of because you only have two beers. Or it would be like, I don't know, VHS and Beta. It's just like liberal versus conservative, or in your case, I guess it's NDP versus conservative. It's just boring. It's boring to only have two options. It's boring to be told that any other option, Alberta Party, Wild Rose, is just a waste, that you're splitting the left, you're splitting the right. So essentially, First Past the Post is based on this idea that whoever has the most votes wins. It sounds nice. It has a nice ring to it. If I'm running against you for mayor and one of us has the most votes, then that person should win. It works great for a two-candidate race. As soon as you add a third party or a third candidate, and this is for mayor, for council, it totally falls apart. You can end up with someone winning the vote with 40%, 30%, 20%. We have city councilors in Toronto who won their wards with as low as 17% of the vote. So you can literally have a case where you have an incumbent government or incumbent councillor who's already in power. The majority of their constituents don't want them back. The majority votes against them, and they win the election anyways. Melissa's bringing up a great point. Why did Trudeau's campaign promise of electoral reform die? So there's a lot of agreement amongst reformers that First Past the Post has to go. There isn't always agreement on what should replace it with. And this is mostly because of a lot of myths and disinformation about the alternatives. The only real worthwhile alternatives to look at for a provincial or federal election is some kind of proportional or semi-proportional system. Now, I know a lot of you have heard the words proportional associated with extremism and instability and Italy and Israel. Proportional just means that the outcome looks the same as what people voted for. It's almost a synonym for election or democracy. So if 20% of Albertans or Canadians, want the orange or green or purple party to be in power, then 20% of the House is purple or green. That's it. It's not a crazy idea. It's actually the simplest way to imagine any election working. And despite the fact that, yes, Italy and Israel use proportional representation, so does New Zealand and Finland and Sweden and Germany and pretty much every Western democracy except for the UK and Canada and partially France. In fact, in the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which is this kind of group of, the largest, most influential Western countries, Canada is the only country using first past the post for all three levels of government. We are such an outlier on this. And let me just point out, in case anyone is thinking, though, what I'm proposing is somehow radical and that, our political elites know what's best for us by holding on to this tradition of first past the post. I want to point out that none of our political parties use first past the post to choose their own leaders.
Right.
None of them. Not
Right.
the
They all
Greens,
use a
not
ranked
the
ballot.
Liberals, not the NDP, not the Conservatives. None of them.
Right.
So
Right.
they all use, at minimum, they use a ranked ballot, which is probably the most common voting system in the world. And it shifts you from what's called a plurality election, where whoever has the most votes wins, even if most people didn't want you. And it shifts you towards a real majority election, where you need to get 50% of the vote to win, which gives you a whole bunch of benefits. When you get to rank your choices, there's no vote splitting. You can always vote with your heart. So it allows for new voices like an Alberta Party or a Wild Rose to grow organically without having to reemerge. It encourages more women and people of color to run because they're the ones who are often pushed out of races, especially at the municipal level, which is technically nonpartisan. So all the nominations kind of happen behind the scenes, where if you have three candidates running for mayor and they might split a vote, there's a lot of behind the scenes discussions about who should drop out of the race. With a ranked ballot, all that disappears. It also encourages more civility because candidates want, if I'm running against you for mayor, I want your supporters to like me enough to rank me second, so I'm not going to attack you. But that alone doesn't give you proportionality. The best two models to look at are mixed member proportional, which is used in Germany and New Zealand. I don't think either of those can be accused of being wildly unstable. In fact, New Zealand right now has a coalition with two female party leaders who didn't even need to work together. Labor actually won a real majority and said, well, let's offer some cabinet seats to the Greens anyways, just because it's nice to work together. So that's the crazy and unstable extremism happening in New Zealand. It's women party leaders working together. We have neither of those things happening in Canada. We don't have any female leaders right now. Every premier in Canada right now is a male.
Yep.
Very often the blood hereditary lineage of their dad, whether it's Doug Ford doing what his dad did or Justin Trudeau doing what his dad did. So we have this really hostile, polarized, male-dominated, hereditary lineage political landscape that is incredibly informed by a voting system that perpetuates all of those things. But my message to everyone out there, to go back to Melissa's question, is we shouldn't be focused on national voting reform right now. The way that all reforms happen is they start municipal. How did we get the vote for women for federal elections? Well, 5 years before that, we won it provincially, first in Manitoba and then Saskatchewan, and slowly it spread. But before that, by 1900, we already had voting rights for women at the city level. So if you want to see voting reform provincially and federally, start thinking about how we elect our city councils in Calgary, in Edmonton, and in the hundreds of municipalities in Alberta and across the country.
Well, that sets up my next question perfectly. So, and first of all, I'll take a step back and just say that my hypothesis is that folks that are concerned about climate and spend time working on it and trying to change it, we're probably more likely to be familiar with these two different systems of voting and looking to encourage the ranked ballot and having probably, most of us are probably aware of and upset with Trudeau's decision not to push that through, is my guess. And I'm not supposed to be a partisan guy on this show, but that's my guess. And I hear what you're saying about the municipal level, and that actually dovetails with climate work. because, for us climate folks, an individual can change his whole life, and that change is easy, but the impact is low. And then the other side of it is at the systemic level, the impact is enormous, but it's so difficult to do. So the sweet spot is community. So I see a lot of similarities there. So I guess the question that I want to ask is, for this upcoming municipal election here in Calgary, is the cake already baked, or is there something that we're able to try to can we try to make some change somehow for this coming election in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, we only get this chance once every 4 years. I think all good change starts municipally, and the best time to influence politicians is during an election year. So this is an incredibly exciting year for Albertans, in my opinion. And again, we tend to think of campaign finance reform and voting reform in terms of legislatures. All those things can happen municipally and are actually more likely to start municipally for a variety of reasons. One is that you don't have the kind of party discipline, at least not overtly, and nowhere near as strictly as we do provincially or federally. So if you want to get a new policy implemented in your provincial legislature or in Ottawa, you literally have to convince not even just a party in power, but the one person who's running that party. Because not only, so we have the most centralized Westminster model out of all the Commonwealth countries. And I assume this is the same in your provincial legislature. You'll have to correct me if I'm wrong. But here in Ontario's legislature, and definitely in Ottawa, everyone votes along party lines, to the extent that, I ask in the book, do we even have legislatures? Do we have a legislative branch? I don't see any evidence of that. We essentially have an unelected executive branch that has all the power. We have like the worst of all models, where we don't even get to elect our executive branch, and then like one guy gets to take complete control of a province, usually against the will of the majority. I mean, we're almost, I half joke in the book about how you could almost compare our political system to most of the primary aspects of medieval decision-making 800 years ago, which was single person, all the power against the will of the majority, and doing what their dad did. Right. Yeah. It's like, I mean, we could laugh, but it's like, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, that is what we're doing. I'm just going to interrupt for a second, interrupt myself. Maddie is asking, is there a book you're aware of that chronicles examples of municipal solutions? There is a great book. Oh my God, it's mine.
Hey, I got it too.
I'm sure there's lots out there, but I actually did an incredible amount of research into municipalities who are doing great reform at the hyper-local level. And I actually did a lot of that work in Alberta. I reference Edmonton and Calgary in particular many times in the book. Calgary's got some
that's a really cool part about reading this book is that it does mention our city quite often. It was great to read that. And
of all the campaign reform laws that I looked at for campaign finance, like what is the best way to get lobbyist money and corporate money out of elections? And the best example I found at any level of government, anywhere in North America, was municipal elections in Seattle. And I go into detail about how it's better than any model we've had in Canada. It's better than the per vote subsidy, which has lots of flaws to it. It's better than the municipal rebate program we have here in Toronto, where if I give $100 to a campaign, I get some of that money back to me as a donor a year later. And I interviewed kids in Tacoma Park in the States who are already allowed to vote at 16, because again, all things start municipal. No 16-year-olds can vote state level or national in North America, but in cities they can. Online voting, which is something a lot of people are pushing for, hasn't been touched yet federally or at the state level, but cities have been doing it all across Ontario for 10 years, no issues, no complaints. So yeah, but what was the question you just asked? I feel like I went off topic.
So I guess what I want to know is I asked about whether this coming
Yeah.
municipal election is baked in the cake. Is there some low hanging fruit that we could be like, hey,
So
while you're doing this, yeah,
So again, let me go back to my first message I started out with. My message to all 32 participants who are watching tonight: get involved with the election, but don't just get involved with who's winning or who's losing. Because if you do that, we're all losing. Because what we need to change is the DNA of the political system. Think about it. When's the last time you upgraded the operating system of your cell phone? I would be amazed if you haven't done it in the past 2 months, definitely the past year. I mean, we're constantly being told, I feel like every week it's telling me to upgrade my system. It's telling me right now, no joke, software update. Look at that.
Ooh,
There's my
that's a
son, by the
setup
way.
right there.
There's my 16-year-old son who isn't allowed to vote yet. Where did he go? Oh, Claire.
I did see it. That's
This is why I'm doing
serendipity.
it.
Yeah.
There we go. My nephew and my son, 15
Okay,
and
there you go.
16, totally ready to vote.
Yeah.
When was the last time we upgraded the operating system of Canada's democracy?
Right.
Never, which is crazy. And it's because we have this idea that our democratic institutions are carved in stone. They shall not be amended. It's almost seen as sacrilegious, inappropriate, offensive to the fathers of Confederation for us to suggest that there's a better way, when in fact it's the exact opposite. The people who founded this country and America and the British model, they were the rebels of their time. They were the people who challenged the monarchy and said, we want responsible government. The best way to respect what they gave us is to continue to be disruptors, to continue to be people who challenge the concentration of power and systems that give an unfair advantage to corporate voices, to insider voices, rather than decentralizing power to ordinary people. And we have got a long way to go, because in many ways, we've never had power as centralized as we have it right now, provincially and federally. But again, everything starts municipal. So what I'm encouraging you guys to do is start looking at what democratic reforms you could strategically push for at the municipal level. And instead of just rooting for candidate A or candidate B for Ward 7 or Ward 9 or whatever, start asking all the candidates, do you support this reform? Do you support this reform?
So what I guess what I'm asking is what reform do you think, this city, what reform do you think would be reasonable for us to, like, for example, so for the Climate Hub, we're going to be pushing hard to try to get people to think about the election as a climate election, to think about all elections as a climate election. But elections are part of how we get to where we want to be on climate. So what reform, what off the top of your head, what reform, if the Hub was to try to advocate for one electoral reform during this election, what might that reform be?
What's your campaign finance situation right now? Do you have any municipal campaign finance mechanism?
Well, I know that the last election, there was a lot of money that flowed into to Nancy's opponent. I don't think I'm being political here. I think it's a well-established thing. And so I don't know the exact structure of the campaign finance system, but I know that
anyone can chime in here on the chat. So my two questions are, do you have reasonable campaign spending limits at the municipal level that prevents you from spending exorbitant amounts of money? And three. Number two,
that's right. Yep.
Is there a limit per person, how much they can give? Are corporations allowed to give, or do you ban corporate and union donations? And most importantly, is there any kind of subsidy? Is there any kind of subsidy where you have government public funding of municipal election campaigns?
Yeah, so
we're getting some answers here from Joe.
Yeah, and Joe reminded me there because the government, our provincial government just made it a whole lot easier for PACs and corporations to throw money at whatever candidates they want. And you and I may have a sense of what types of candidates those will be, but it's the Wild West right now, I think, as far as finance reforms go.
Wow.
or
So
as fine.
everything Joe is posting sounds like a disaster.
Yeah, that's about
So
right.
that is winnable, because the hardest things to campaign for are things that where you're the leader. No one's done it before. So like I've been advocating for municipal voting reform here in Ontario, and we're winning, but it's been really slow. We actually got there's a report you can get. London leads how one Canadian city switched from first past the post to ranked ballot elections,
Okay,
and how yours can too. I'll get to that in a second.
right.
That's been really hard, but we did get it. The London City Council in Ontario is the only government in Canada that has actually ditched first past the post.
Yeah.
That was hard because we were convincing them to become the first. So we'll get to that one in a second, because I think you should push for that in Calgary. But the easier one is campaign finance, because it sounds like you guys are really behind. Ontario has great campaign finance rules. Quebec has even better, and BC used to be the Wild West. They've brought in better rules. If you don't have good campaign finance rules, developers and the largest corporations will always get their way in the long run. If they lose an election and someone gets in they don't like, they'll make sure that they don't last very long.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing I'll mention really briefly, but it's a filter you should put all of your municipal thoughts through, is don't get too wrapped up in who the mayor is. I'm a Nenshi fan, by the way, but that's irrelevant to my point, which is that mayors in Canada only have one vote. And unless you have a wildly different council structure in Calgary than we do here in Toronto, it doesn't really matter who the mayor is. They kind of have the first shot at building a consensus on council. They have influence over committee structures and committee chairs, perhaps setting the agenda. But if you get the council you want, that's more important than the mayor. And I think a slippery slope we all fall into is getting so wrapped up in the mayoral campaign that we forget the rest. In fact, I'll bet many Calgarians don't know the name of their councillor, but they all know the name of their mayor. And this goes for federal and provincial too. How many people know the name of their MLA or their MP? I mean, I bet it's less than 5% of the population. I wouldn't be surprised if it was less than 2%. I forget the names of mine sometimes, and I'm a very engaged Democratic type of folk. So Pamela wrote, they have campaign finance rules, individual contributions recently increased. Okay, so it sounds like your campaign finance rules really suck. I have a whole chapter on this, and I go through all the different ways that you can fix this and which ones are best. And what I would put together is a multi-partisan campaign around democratic reform that isn't left-wing, isn't right-wing, isn't about the environment. It's just about people having a voice, leveling the playing fields, decentralizing power, making the system work for everyone. And you could even get groups on board like the Manning Center, like work all across party lines on this. The Reform Party, which started out where you are, they had a lot of policy areas I didn't like. This goes back to the 80s. Half of you were like, what's he talking about? What's the Reform Party? But half of you know exactly what I'm talking about. But they were the largest federal Democratic, they were called the Reform Party because they wanted to change the system, including a lot of issues that I feel very strongly about decentralizing power in the House of Commons and giving more power to individual MPs. You've got within your conservative base in the prairies a real thirst for democratic change. Put that to use. Create bridges between conservatives and liberals and New Democrats out west who believe that democracy works better when it's decentralized, and you use all that free market language that conservatives love out there and be like, we need to liberate the democratic marketplace. So there could be an entrepreneurial political spirit where startups and entrepreneurs and new voices actually have a chance at being heard, whether that's a political startup like the Alberta Party or the Wild Rose, or it's just like some 20-year-old kid who wants to run for mayor on the right or the left without being told, oh, you're going to split the vote. You're going to hurt it for Nenshi, or you're going to hurt it for Joe business developer guy.
Yep.
Anyone who isn't the big front runner, one of the two big front runners, is always accused of being a spoiler.
Yep.
And it destroys our ability to appreciate and encourage new, young, diverse voices. So to answer your question, sorry, that was like a 20-minute answer to a simple question. The two things I would encourage you to campaign for, and don't do this in a partisan way, really, like just set up a survey of which candidates support this and this and that. Campaign finance reform.
Mm-hmm.
And the term being used in the US that has been very successful for this is clean money. So getting dirty money out of elections and having clean elections. And just Google clean elections US, and you'll find these massive, heavily resourced, massive volunteers, full-time staff campaigns working on clean elections in the US. And the second is get ranked ballots.
Yep.
Even though ranked ballots on their own aren't the most ideal voting system for our federal and provincial elections, we need to get people used to using different types of ballots. And ranked ballots can be used in proportional systems, they can be used in majority systems, but it would be amazing to get people in Calgary and Edmonton thinking about how the mayor of the city should get 50% of the vote. How can you be the mayor of a city if most people didn't vote for you? Mm-hmm. Which is what we do all the time, again, provincially, and you don't do it as much provincially. Maybe you do, it depends, just because you tend to have two-party elections. So I don't know how the vote splitting happens. But push for ranked ballots. We've been doing it in Ontario. I'm just gonna put a link into the chat. Unlockedemocracy.ca is a national nonprofit. I'm the creative director. We're pushing for municipal voting reform, and we're going to be launching a campaign soon called Local Choice, where we're asking provincial governments to give cities the option of using ranked ballots. But that'll only happen if places like Calgary Council and Edmonton Council ask for permission. So check out Unlock Democracy. You can sign up for our email newsletter on that website. You can find us on Twitter. And if you really want to plug in and support that movement, we do have a Patreon page, which you can click on, and you can send us a few dollars every month, and that supports our work. And the biggest movement we have right now on this issue is in Ontario and BC. And I would love to add Alberta to that map. In fact, I think if you go to their website right now, you're obviously on your computer. So why don't we all go to unlockedemocracy.ca, click on Local Choice. And I think I actually added a map on there yesterday. There you go. Check that out. I hope you, why don't I share my screen?
Sure.
Share screen. Host is disabled. Can you make me a co-host?
Yes, I can. Let me see here.
Yes, Mike and Joe. Absolutely. So what you need. Hi, Tracy. BC is awesome. Thanks for joining us. So don't worry about the sharing screen. Half of you have already looked at it. Yes. So there's a map on there that shows which provincial parties have endorsed Local Choice. And we've got Greens, New Democrats, Liberals from all across Canada, nothing in Alberta yet. So I would love to see this happening in Alberta. I think it is, I think it's the most important change. I really do. Yeah. I think we're sentencing ourselves to an eternity of two-party cartel, just going back and forth. Because the other terrible thing about having two parties and first past the post is what I call fishtail legislation. So one party comes in, let's say Rachel Notley, brings in all this new stuff, and then a new party comes in and they're like, okay, it's the summer of repeal. We're gonna undo everything the previous government did. This is crazy. This is what we do provincially. It's what we do federally. And we just go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And you know what? The parties don't care. They love it. All the parties, I can't make this clear enough. Mm-hmm. All the parties love the current system. And anyone who thinks that the NDP is in support of voting reform is on drugs. And not like just drugs that make you feel fuzzy, like ecstasy or pot, like deep hallucinatory drugs that totally knock you out. Because if the NDP supported voting reform, then the provinces who have had majority NDP governments in the past decade, which includes, oh, I don't know, yours
Yep.
and Nova Scotia and Saskatchewan and Manitoba and BC, like, show me any evidence that the NDP wants voting reform. So
Yeah, everybody who gets
they're
in,
so full of shit on this, and I'm sorry to swear, but it
I
makes
think
me
it's
so
okay.
angry. It makes me angry because, again, it illustrates my point that, like, forget about who's winning elections,
Yeah.
because in so many ways, and I'm sorry if I'm upsetting any partisans on this call, and of course
Yeah.
the NDP and Conservative Party have very different policies on green energy and lots of things, but
Yeah.
none of them are prepared to change the system in the way that we need to change it, because the NDP would rather wait 4 years or 8 years or 12 years for that fake majority than have to share power in a collaborative way with other parties under proportional representation. We are the ones who are suffering under all of these parties, because as they trade power back and forth, waiting for their next fake majority, we're the ones who are suffering.
Yeah.
So what we need is collaborative coalitions who work together with evidence-based, thoughtful, meaningful legislation, and we will only get that with bottom-up grassroots movements pushing for change. And those changes will start at the municipal level, and you have a great chance to do that this year in Calgary.
Daniela says if this was an in-person event, she'd be on her feet clapping. And
you can still get up and clap.
Yeah, go ahead, by all means.
Do
Daniela
it.
does some great work for us.
Thanks, Daniela.
So we're going to go to our panelists shortly. I want to say a few words to some of the folks that helped make this event possible, and then I think we'll come back for a few more questions, because I still have a few more in the wings.
I'm gonna jump in for 1 second. Someone just mentioned Christine Boyle. Thank you, Lisa. Christine Boyle is a city councillor in Vancouver who just put forward an amendment asking the province for local choice so they can use ranked ballots, which will give them more women, more people of color, more choice. So my question to you is, 1 year from now on Calgary Council, who is your Christine Boyle?
Yeah.
Who's your Michael Chong? He's a Conservative MP who's big into democratic reform. I don't care if they're on the right, on the left. I don't even care if they believe in climate change. Do they care about democratic reform? With the right democratic structures, we will win good policies on climate change. So fight for that.
Okay, that sounds good. So a couple of words from, first, I guess you'd call our sponsors. On behalf of the Calgary Climate Hub, I'd like to take this moment to recognize the support of the Alberta Ecotrust Foundation, whose grant programs have helped bring forward so many great Alberta-specific environmental initiatives, including this broadcast. They're a group of very smart people that care about the right things, and in my humble opinion, they'll only become more and more important to this province as time goes by. Dave's getting a glass of water. Okay, good. Stay lubricated. The Calgary Climate Hub is a nonpartisan organization, and we're not in the business of telling you who we think you should or should not vote for. We will, however, remind you that in 2021 and going forward, every election is a climate election. And that's perfectly reasonable for the people asking for your vote to have an answer when you ask them for their climate plan. You can join the Calgary Climate Hub in making that ask by becoming a member and joining our newly formed elections node. There's a core group of dedicated volunteers seeking to ensure that climate is part of the debate and on the ballot. So you can, I'm sure there'll be a post in the chat about how to become a volunteer, and Dr. Joe Vipund, our co-chair, will be on later on to talk to you about how you can help the Climate Hub. If you can't volunteer, we do seek some donations. And finally, before we move on to the panelists for our show, I'd just like to invite you to next week's Climate of Change, where we will be interviewing Jason Ribeiro, the Strategic Director for Calgary Economic Development, as well as the curator of Global Shapers Calgary, a group of young professionals driving dialogue, action, and change in the Calgary community. It's going to be another great show. So you can find the RSVP link in the chat, and hope to see you next week. Okay, so for the next portion of our show, we have a few guest panelists to ask some questions of Dave. Our first panelist has been drafted as one of our co-chairs for the aforementioned Climate Hub Elections Node. Her name is Adrita Hawk. So we'll see if she's able to come on. And looks like there she is.
Hi.
Hi, Adrita. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And nice to see you, Dave. I really loved your book, so it's great to hear your conversation today. So my question for you, and you did just kind of talk about it, but I want to get a bit more into it. So one of the things we're doing for the Climate Hub is, like you said, we're going to be sending out questions to all the candidates and asking topics related to climate action, environment, and things like that, right? But Alberta is very polarized. So what I'm wondering is, when we post the candidates' response, and we're going to be posting all of their responses. So I guess what I'm wondering is, because a lot of people are generally lean more right, wouldn't that kind of oppose them to choose the candidates that oppose climate action? And if you think that is the case, then what are some ways to go around that?
Yeah, I mean, you're dipping into some pretty touchy stuff over there that I know of course. It's kind of the defining image of Alberta, of this like polarization. I would like to think that on the ground level, it's more nuanced than the stereotype that there's people who want to save the environment and people who want to just rip all the oil out of the land and don't care about the environment. I mean, I have a lot of empathy for those who in Alberta rely on the industry for their income and their family, or maybe their entire town like wouldn't exist without an extraction related income. So I think what's required for both sides is an enormous amount of empathy. If we shut down the oil sands, the tar sands, whatever you want to call it, tomorrow, it would be catastrophic economically for a lot of people. So the question is, how do you build, and I'm sure I'm saying something you've all heard a million times and thought of, this isn't Dave Meslin's brilliance, but I would like to believe that there could be, what's the word I'm looking for? Some kind of universal buy-in towards the idea that while Alberta is economically dependent on a certain resource right now, that it's in everyone's interest to shift towards a green-based economy, even just for the point that oil is finite. Like, okay, let's say we love oil. What happens when it's gone? Let's start planning now. I mean, to me, it shouldn't be that polarized. It's in everyone's interest to be investing heavily right now in green jobs, green infrastructure, green education, green curriculum, all of that. I think it's a trap to assume that there's two types of Albertans and that it's polarized, especially because first past the post is the real culprit for dividing us. If we had proportional representation in Alberta, you wouldn't have these two parties that force you into being like, am I pro-oil or am I pro-environment? There would be 10 parties and there would be like there'd be so much room for middle ground. And I think most Albertans would gravitate towards a middle ground where they're like, yeah, my brother and my uncle work for oil, so I'm kind of torn on this, but like, I'm terrified about climate change. I want to vote for a party that's talking about both. As long as Alberta's polarized, I think you're screwed. The only path forward is to have legislation and policies that acknowledge the realities of your current economy with the catastrophic, environmental train wreck that is barreling down towards us. So try and break the polarization. Don't feed it. And that might be a totally ignorant, useless thing for an Ontarian to tell you. So, and I want to premise all this with that. Like, I know a lot about voting systems. I know a lot about campaign finance reform. I want to be careful not to try and pretend that I can give you advice about Alberta because I'm not there. So that was my ignorant, naive thoughts on Albertan political landscape. You can ignore it all.
No, thank you. I appreciate that, especially for me. Like I work in the energy sector, right? So I'm always very conflicted between these topics and how to bridge the gap. So that's how I was kind of wondering for your advice, and that is actually quite helpful. I think empathy is definitely the key factor.
Adrita, do you want to ask a follow-up question?
I do have another question, and it's not fully related, but I guess what I was wondering is, in your book, you had mentioned a lot about how, in-person events go a lot further, handing out paper copies versus, social media things, right? So, I mean, during a pandemic, that's obviously a lot harder. And with municipal elections coming out, I was wondering, what do you think are some of the best ways to, go around that, and how to really use social media?
Yeah, that's a good question. Your elections, is it in the fall?
It's October 18.
October. So hopefully by then, you know, hopefully by then we're allowed to start hanging out again, and that's when the campaign really picks up. I mean, if we're not all vaccinated by then, I don't know what these governments are doing. So what I'm talking, so I'm a big social media guy. I love using social media to get messages out, and I always encourage people to use all the platforms out there. And it's hard because there's always new ones coming out. So I'm working on this campaign I mentioned before to lower the voting age. And I'm like, okay, we got to talk to teens. You know, what are teens on these days? And like every month they're switching to a new app. So like this whole week I spent learning about Discord, which I'd never heard of 2 weeks ago. And Discord's the funniest thing is if you ask a 14-year-old if they're on Discord, the responses range from, yeah, of course, all the way to, ooh, gross. That's what all the gamer boys are on. But get to know all those platforms, use them. What I'm talking about in the book is that you use the social media to raise awareness and to gather people's names and contact information. But at the end of the day, you really need to get them into a room. And again, I hope by September you can. I use all my social media and my email lists, and I have tons of email lists, and they're on Nation Builder and MailChimp and Google Sheets. I use different platforms for different campaigns, depending on their size and their resources. But my goal is always to get bums in seats, to get people into a room. I just think you can create a certain energy and social interaction and community building in physically in ways that you can't do online. Although I should mention to you, like, I wrote the book pre-COVID, and we weren't having events like these online back then. Like, you know, they existed, Zoom existed, Skype existed. I think I would probably argue less. I would make that argument less now than I would before. I actually think that we've all learned how to, like, even was it Danielle who was talking about jumping up and down before and clapping? So, you know, there'd be more energy in the room if we all were able to jump up and clap. And if I was making eye contact with all 32 of you. I actually prefer for events like this to have everyone's video on. So that's a tip I would offer to the Climate Hub. I really like seeing all the videos on. I know it makes it easier for people to, what's it called, Zoom bomb or whatever. I think it's worth the risk. I like seeing the interactions. But I guess for me, like the people I work with, my colleagues, my collaborators, activist friends, I didn't meet them online. I met them in rooms. I met them at conferences, at summits, in workshops. So I guess what I'm saying is use the digital tools, but don't be misled into thinking that digital organizing replaces old-fashioned face-to-face interaction. And then the thing about paper is that I still think receiving something at your doorstep, a knock on the door, a flyer at your doorstep is still the best way to reach anyone at any age, because it breaks through the clutter, which is why companies still send us junk mail. Mm-hmm. Companies with $1 million budgets to buy all the social media boosted posts they want on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook still send us full color catalogs and flyers every week to our door. And if you want to be a grassroots campaign, running for councillor or for mayor in October, you better have some really beautiful pieces of paper that you're knocking on people's door and handing out to them. Fully recycled, 100% post-consumer vegetable-based inks.
Right. Thank you, Adrita, for coming on and asking us a question. Also for the work you're doing on the Calgary Climate Hub's election note.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a couple of more panelists. I just drafted another one, but our next panelist might be one of our most, I want to call her one of our most prolific hubsters. Joan Lawrence is a Hub board member who probably finds a way to help out just about everything we do, including this broadcast. And we're very lucky to have her. So Joan Lawrence, come on down. You're the next contestant on A Climate of Change. I don't think I'm keeping that.
Yay! I'll take the washer. Hi, Dave. I'm so glad to get the chance to speak to you, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm really interested about some of the citizen education that has been done in Toronto and here in Calgary with City Hall School, and what are the elements of a really good education system for adults so that we can increase people's advocacy?
Amazing question. I talk about this in depth in the book, both for youth in the context of civics education and for adults. And the reason this is important is because I think most people just have no clue how politics works. Again, I don't think most people know the name of their counselor or their MLA, but that's not a complicated question to answer. If people don't know that, then they definitely don't know, the important names in the civil service or the people behind the scenes, the staff, the political advisors. They don't know the procedure of how a piece of legislation gets started and goes through first reading, second reading, committee process. What's a private member's bill? How does the budget process work? What's the difference between a capital budget and an operating budget? I don't think most people know the difference between municipal, provincial, and federal jurisdiction. And anyone who's run for office for any of those levels will tell you that they knock on people's doors and people are, you're running for a municipal election and someone will say, well, I want more healthcare funding. And they're like, well, we don't do that. Or you're running for a federal election for a member of parliament and someone says, why isn't my garbage picked up last week? So how can we expect people to fight for climate change policy solutions when they have no idea what the rules of the game are? And this is important because when we feel confused about something, we're likely to just avoid it, even just because we're too either consciously embarrassed or just subconsciously it feels uncomfortable or awkward, right? So like an easy analogy would be like trying to play baseball if you didn't know the rules of baseball. So if I just gave you a bat, I'm like, okay, you're up to bat. And you're like, where do I stand? What do I do? And then you hit the ball and you're like, you just start running towards third base. I mean, you wouldn't play again. You'd also probably get injured or injure someone else. So, I mean, this is what politics is. So we assume that all we need to do is go out there and be like, you should vote. Everyone go vote. It's important. That's actually a really patronizing approach to political engagement, because that would be like telling someone, come on, play baseball. And they're like, I don't know how. And they're like, come on, here's the bat, hit the ball. And again, they hit the ball and they don't know how to run, how to steal, like how to get around the four bases. So it's so important that we not patronize adults by just saying, come on, vote, it's important. And realizing that our educational system intentionally, through negligence, fails to inform people about the complexities of our democratic structures. The best solution I've seen to that, and I write about this in this book, in the book, is City Hall School, which only exists, as far as I know, in Alberta. It was created in Edmonton. It's been replicated in Calgary. If you don't know about it, it is so amazing. If you grew up in Calgary, you might have gone to it. It's an incredible model that needs to be greatly expanded. The only fault of it is that it's too small. So a very small segment of the population actually goes through it. But I visited the Calgary school 3 times and the Edmonton school twice, because it's the best civics education model I've seen in Canada. Another huge problem that we have with civics education, including this is also part of your City Hall school, is that we tend to focus too much on charitable forms of engagement. And what I mean by that is, on any given issue, there is immediate important band-aid solutions that we need to do, but there's even more important long-term policy solutions. So for example, homelessness. You could tell a 12-year-old, hey, you should care about homelessness. Let's make sandwiches for homeless people, which is a very nice thing to teach a 12-year-old. But anyone working in the homeless or housing sector will tell you that we're only perpetuating the homeless crisis with every new food bank we create and every new sleeping bag we hand out, because we're just hiding the problem instead of solving the reasons why these problems exist. And for every, for every time we tell a 12-year-old that they should, participate in a program to make sandwiches for those who are homeless, we should also be taking them through a workshop on how legislative policies, federal, provincial, and municipal, create and perpetuate homelessness, whether it's lack of rent control, whether it's lack of a proper minimum wage, whether it's lack of proper mental health services, whether it's whatever, on and on and on. I don't need to tell all of you that there are a large menu of policy solutions that have already been discussed, and reports have been written about them on every issue, from pharmacare to healthcare to homelessness to housing to mental health to suicide, and of course, topic of tonight, climate. We know what the solutions are for climate. We've known for a long time what they are. So back to your question though, we need to have better civics education for kids that is comprehensive, that is a full credit in multiple years of elementary and secondary school. But we also need to create easy, fun, accessible ways for adults to learn the ropes. And one of the comparisons I make in the school, in the book, is Home Depot and places like Home Depot offer free courses every Saturday or Sunday of how to use their tools. So how to install tiles, how to build a shed in your backyard. And it's so smart because they know that these courses will pay for themselves, because if more people know how to use tiles and cut tiles, they're going to buy more tiles, which is great for the Home Depot. So, cities should do the same thing. Cities should offer free Civics 101 courses for adults. And if the city won't do it, then the Climate Hub should do it. And get funding for it, make it nonpartisan, get funding from wherever your different funding sources are out there. Start a charitable organization that can give charitable tax receipts for funding. Funding education is the most, nonpartisan political education is the most fundable part of what we do as activists, as advocates. No one's going to fund a campaign to elect a certain person or elect a certain type of person. That's really hard to do. But you should be able to get funding for nonpartisan campaigns around civics education. And it's so important because once people know how the systems work, once they know how to swing a bat and that they're supposed to run for first base, and then they're allowed to steal second, but you can only do it under certain circumstances, man, they'll be like, when's the next game? I want to play. And what's holding so many grown adults back right now from participating is not apathy. It's not because they don't care about the issues. It's because they have no clue where to start.
I think that's true. Joan, do you want a follow-up question there? Did that do it for you? Or?
Well, I know you've got a couple of other people that would like to ask questions, so I'm going to leave it there. But thank you so much, Dave. That was really great.
And I'll just say thank you to you, Joan, for all the great work you do. It's really important. I can't stress enough how important you are. And speaking of important, there's our co-chair, Dr. Joe Vipund, and I had initially scheduled this for 2 panelists, but when I got the doc around, I figure why not bring him in, and so I'll let you take it over there, Doc.
Can you guys see me? I don't know if I'm video up, but Dave, we kind of talked about this prior to the event starting, but my favorite chapter, I think, based because I'm helping to run this organization, was the one on nonprofits, and it really touched me to the point where I actually read it twice. And it's not often I go read a chapter and then I got to make sure I count everything there, read it again. And the reason is because what we're trying to do at the Hub is maybe unique, maybe not so unique, but really hard to fund, which is trying to change the thoughts of an entire city, trying to ensure that all citizens understand what the scientific and social and economic consequences of the climate crisis are. And that's really hard to fund because nobody can really measure how that change occurs. And for the funding for our organization, everybody wants measurables and key performance indicators, probably my least favorite term ever. So yeah, just your thoughts on how to walk out of that.
It's a great question. My cat is meowing at the door to be let in. I'm just going to let him in quickly. It'll take 10 seconds because it's very distracting.
Fill the air.
I don't think we've had a cat moment like this before. We're breaking new ground tonight.
Okay, cat is in. Okay, so yeah, oh my God, fundraising is like the never-ending nightmare for all of us, and it's economic realities create this really unlevel playing field because every large corporation, no matter what they're trying to do, always has legislative goals. They want to weaken legislation that prevents them from doing what they want to do. They want to make it easier to get exemptions from legislation. And just like all other adults I was talking about before, they also don't know how to play baseball. They don't know how the political systems work, but they have the money to hire lobbyists. And a lobbyist is someone who knows how to play baseball. So, or in fact, they're a pinch hitter. They're like, oh, don't worry, we'll take care of that for you. You want this ministry to weaken this regulation to help you produce this? We know how to do that. And of course, the Calgary Climate Hub doesn't have the resources to hire lobbyists. So citizen groups are always at a disadvantage because we can't afford these political navigators which allow corporations to win political victories all the time. And we just hear about the big ones. This is happening on smaller levels every day. Little small changes, revisions, municipal bylaws, exemptions, permits, building permits, zoning changes, all the time. Developers, resource extractors, etc., right down the line, all get their way because they have the resources. So how do we raise the money to at least, we're never going to have a level playing field, but at least give us a shot? So one thing we have working in our favor is that people care about our cause. People care about our cause. Everyone cares about our cause. Let me be as bold to say that even someone who you consider to be on the far right, pro-oil, if you sat them down and had a discussion with them that they didn't think was about partisan politics, and you got them to actually say, you got them to discuss whether they care about the quality of the air, the quality of the water that their children drink. I challenge you to find me anyone, anywhere, who on a gut level doesn't care about the environment. I don't think that person exists. So what you have in your favor that corporations of any stripe do not have is that people care about your cause, and on a gut level, they want you to win. They want you to succeed. And the reason that's so amazing is because there's so many people out there. And the biggest corporations in the world, the ones with trillions of dollars, often make their money $1 at a time. Think of someone like Meslin, right? the corporate buying power that Nestle has, but they only make their money because idiots like me keep buying Kit Kats. And every time I buy a Kit Kat, I'm like, here's $1.50. And those $1.50s add up to Nestle being this huge corporation. So I always think about funding not as like, let's say I need $40,000. Instead of saying, how do I get a $40,000 grant from some big foundation? I think about all the different permutations of how I could crowdsource that money. It's, 40 people giving me $1,000, or maybe it's 40,000 people giving me $1. But what I challenge you, Joe, is to ask yourself, how many people in Calgary do you think want you to succeed? Or let's do this as a calculation. What percentage of Calgarians do you think believe in your goal?
70.
70%?
That's the data.
So do the math. I don't know what the population of Calgary is.
1.4 million, 70% is probably around 1 million.
So if they each give you $1 a year, would that be a nice budget to work with?
I'm all for that.
1.4 million. I mean, that's not a lot to ask for. Now, you're not going to get them all, but let's say you got 10% of them, and some of them gave you $10 a month. Some gave you $50 a month. Some gave you $1 a month. I mean, it's actually, we're asking for peanuts here. And if we can get ourselves into a mindset, it's actually a capitalist mindset. I kind of joke about this in the book, but I think the way to fund our movement successfully is to get into the mindset of an entrepreneur who doesn't go to foundations for money. They're like, okay, I live in Canada. I've got 30 million people to work with. What do they want? What can I offer them? How do I get, 1 million of them to give me $2 for some product? And then in exchange for the product, I get rich. We're offering people something. When we ask people for money, we're not asking them to do us a favor. We're asking them to put a value on the future that they want, on a future they believe in, and pay for it. We're actually doing them a favor. I use the same argument too when I talk to people about media outreach. How do you do good media relations as an activist? Well, the first step is to realize that the relationship between an activist and a journalist is mutually beneficial. And in fact, you're offering more to a journalist than you're getting from them. When you send out a press release about a new, fun, creative campaign that the Climate Hub is doing, we often see it as like, we're asking them for a favor. Like, will you please cover our story? We need you to write about our story. Get out of that mindset and flip it around. You're offering them free content. Journalists need new stories all the time. And you're like, hey, we've got a story for you. And when you're in the mind frame of being someone who's begging for handouts, you're not going to have the right message. And I think I've switched recently to Patreon. It's a online funding model that's used mostly by YouTube creators and podcasters. And I love it because usually when you give money to a group, like all fundraising is shifting towards wanting people to give monthly. But for most groups, I give the Canadian Red Cross $10 a month, and I never hear anything from them. And what I'm doing with Patreon is people give money once a month to my Patreon feed through Unlock Democracy Canada. And in exchange, they get access to behind the scenes content. So I send out all these little messages all the time, and they feel like they're getting an intimate behind the stage, backstage pass, right, into my work. And they get a closer relationship with me. And we only have 53 supporters right now, but it adds up to $1,000 a month, which I wasn't getting before, pays my rent, buys a bit of groceries. And we've only been doing this for 4 months. I think if we continue this model over the next few years, we'll have 2 or 3 full-time staff funded entirely through Patreon. And that is the best model. When you rely on large grants from the United Way or the provincial government, it's really non-sustainable and risky because that that dependency can be ripped away from you by that funder saying, oh, we've shifted our priorities this year. The most sustainable model is from your supporters. If you think you have 1.4 million supporters, you just focus on getting those email addresses so you can offer them. You're not asking them for money, you're offering them a better world, and you're putting a price on it and saying, this is what it costs. Is it worth it to you? And they'll pay for it.
I like it. That sounds good. Joe, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I feel like it's segueing into me asking for money. So maybe I should.
Yes, do that.
If this was like a live event, we would have a pay what you can at the door bucket. And I'm sure the majority of you would say, this was worth $5. This was worth $10 of my money. And you'd be supporting this kind of content. So I'll just say that, as you're being shown the door today, www.calgaryclimatehub.ca/donations is where to go to give us just a little bit of money to keep this going, or a lot of money, because really this is about saving your ass and mine.
That's right. Well, thanks for coming on, Joe. And speaking of saving your ass and mine, Joe's doing some great work here in Alberta to try to raise awareness about taking the right steps on COVID. And we're all very grateful for the work that you do every day. And I should say, he burns the midnight oil on the Climate Hub stuff, and that's when he's not in the emergency room saving lives. So that's who our guy is there. So thanks, nice. Joe, for everything you do. Dave, I've got one more question for you before I do my wrap up, and I'm going to call it the big question, and I may be breaking a few rules here as far as promoting two different books at the same time. But I was really thinking about this. In fact, between your book and Seth Klein's A Good War, I got a lot of the same feeling out of it, in that they both are blueprints. They both show you how to get to where we need to go. And the thing with Seth Klein's A Good War, it's mobilizing Canada for the climate emergency. That's about taking a World War II level footing for Canada to take on the climate crisis and to win the climate crisis. And, we came out of World War II with a strong economy. That's where the whole phrase that a war economy is a good economy came from. Right. And so my question is, can we get to this if we don't have this? Can we save the world? Can we fight and win the climate crisis with an election system that's broken? And how much do we have to save this before we can save this? It can be a little bewildering. Anyways, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. They can happen concurrently, of course. To go back to my analogy of the homeless population, of course we should give them sandwiches. My God, like, there's always an immediate thing we need to be doing now. And, the climate crisis can't wait. But if we're always putting out the immediate fire and stopping, whether it's a pipeline or a piece of legislation or, getting a certain chemical removed from our food or our plastics, that's all important. But as long as we have a political landscape that is designed to push out new ideas and to amplify the most powerful voices at the expense of ordinary people, we will never solve the climate crisis. So let me tie this into, one of the questions that came up on the chat, which is, how quickly do you think we can switch to ranked ballots? And is there any point in even advocating for a voting reform that your current provincial government probably won't even look at? And my answer there is, you need a 10-year plan for any real change. And this is what the corporations are doing. And by the way, the corporations, they're theoretically working in a competitive capitalist environment, but they sure know how to work together. They form every industrial sector, every corporate sector, for better or worse, forms associations where all these companies who supposedly hate each other and fight against each other all come together, all contribute money, and they hire lobbyists on behalf of their sector. And I can tell you that they have long-term strategic goals. They're thinking not about what can I get out of this government, but how do we start shifting the language and the way that journalists talk about issues and the framing of issues, so we win legislation 3 years down the road, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. Will Jason Kenney bring in municipal voting reform? I don't know. I don't care. It's not the right question to ask, because if the next government might bring it in, you better be planting those seeds now,
Right.
because you can't suddenly grab fruit off of a tree. Like, you know, there's a lot of seed planting, watering, pruning, and preparation and patience that goes into any legislative victory. If you ever win the right to use ranked ballots at the local level, chances are it's not going to happen this year or next year or the next year. And that might sound like a demoralizing thing to say, but I hope you'll embrace it as the exact opposite. Because what happens if you fight for short-term political goals that are not pragmatic is you lose. And that will lead you towards a demoralizing spiral.
Mm-hmm.
And you won't be able to attract volunteers or donors, because what volunteers and donors love is the idea that you're winning, that
Right.
there are small victories. So the victory for voting reform isn't that suddenly Jason Kenney brings in proportional representation. That is a losing goal that you shouldn't be wasting any time on, because, you know, if the NDP is not going to do it, Jason Kenney's not going to do it, folks.
Mm-hmm.
So the big victory for you is that some city councilor next year, you know, Joe Schmo, sorry, Joe, that's not your name, but I can't see your last name. Morris Bentley, sorry, I can't see your first name, Steve. Some city councilor next year successfully moves a motion saying, we want to bring in campaign finance reform in Calgary, and we want to bring in ranked ballots.
Yeah.
And maybe the way we're going to do that is we're proposing a citizens assembly to explore this and to explore recommendations. And we want the provincial government. And then in your next round of provincial elections, then you start asking those parties, okay, who's going to give Calgary City Council what they asked for? Who's going to let them bring in campaign finance reform? You need a 10-year plan.
Right.
And the 10-year plan does not even consider who's in power now. It doesn't matter. It's about bringing journalists on board, getting community endorsements, raising awareness, getting 5,000 subscribers to your MailChimp account, getting 20,000 Twitter followers, getting 40,000 people giving you $1 a month, right? Which adds up pretty quickly.
Right.
Anyways, so to go back to your question, we need to fight for any goal that is tangible or has the immediacy. If someone wants to build a highway through prime agricultural land, yeah, you know, don't wait 10 years to stop that highway. Chain yourself to that bulldozer tomorrow. But if you want to see real systemic change that gives us thoughtful, evidence-based, scientific policy change that we need, you better have a 10-year plan.
Yeah, and so yeah, I just noticed that looks like Annette has donated for a small monthly donation. Thank you, Annette. Okay, so I think that's almost it for this week's Climate of Change. What I would say is this whole broadcast is on Facebook Live, and I always go in after the show and answer a few questions here or there. And you know, it's possible that we may see our incredible guest Dave Meslin pop in either tonight or in the next few days at some point and answering your questions or keeping this conversation going. I want to thank you, Dave, first of all, for writing an important book that, as I said, has made me smarter. I value books that are like this. I will hold this and keep this and pass this to people that I think could use it. I'm really grateful that you'd come onto the show. I know that the Calgary Climate Hub as a whole was very excited to have you come on. So thanks for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure is mine, and I'm so inspired to see groups like this fighting so hard. And this is what it's all about. This is the type of grassroots community organizing that makes us all smarter and builds networks and builds community and will lead us towards a greener future. This is what it's at. Thank you.
You bet. You bet. Thanks, man. And I'll just reiterate something that Joe said earlier, Dr. Joe Vipund. There is in the web or in the chat, there's all sorts of links to our website, and we're always looking for more volunteers to help us with I'll just say flat out great work that we're doing. It's not me patting myself on the back. I believe in this organization, and I believe in what we've done, and I believe in where we're going. Not everybody has the time to go and join a climate hub. But what I would say, and what I say every week is, or every show that I have, every chance that I get, is if climate is something that you feel and it gives you anxiety, you need a climate hub in your life. And, Joan Baez says the antidote to despair is action. And what I can tell you is I live it. When the skies are blood red out there, I'm very grateful that I can go to sit around a room, now it's digitally, but at a table full of really smart people that are working on impactful change and how to get there. So consider joining us as a member. And, the other side of that is if you don't have the time, we understand that. But maybe you've got a few bucks to give to a cause like this. What I can tell you is there's no tougher dollar than climate in Calgary. Yeah, I mean, a garage band artist has a better go of it than working climate in this city. We need whatever support we can get. So consider giving us a hand. That's about it. I mean, I guess, again, I'll reiterate, we're immensely grateful for the support of the Alberta Ecotrust for this broadcast. Next Thursday's Climate of Change episode features Jason Ribeiro. That's going to be another humdinger. I want to thank my producer, Shay Rogers, and all the volunteers that help make this thing happen. And finally, I want to thank you, the viewer. Good night. Good night for now, and let's get to work. Thanks, Dave. Good night.